I love what you had to say there about women aren't broken, the system is. It sounds like you might have a bit of a manifesto around that.
Nowhere along the way did the system go, well, geez, if these women are doing 38, 40-hour weeks at work and they're still carrying the 30, 40 hours of unpaid work at home, how is that possible? This is not women's fault that they're discriminated against, that there's pay gaps, that we've got this inordinate workload that's just not manageable by most humans, and that we still try and stuck in having a life around the edges of that and get to midlife and go, holy hell, what do I do with myself? I can't cope with this anymore. In 80% of cases, what they found was women, like for like with men, were earning less. So the pay gaps they labelled a flexibility tax. Women are perceived as less interested in their careers, less reliable in their careers once they've had children, or if they're young, they're probably going to have children. So again, circles back to that system is broken, favouring men for reasons that are just fundamentally inaccurate and unfair. Capacity is the big thing I like to talk about with women. I've often worked beyond capacity for a long time, and it almost becomes ingrained in our psyche. If I say no, it's going to rock the boat. But the reality is you have to honour your capacity, or eventually you'll just stop. You burn out. There'll be some sort of breakdown, whether it's physical or mental.
What does it take to be a financially empowered woman? And what can financially empowered women do together to change the world? A shocking statistic is that around 400,000 women in Australia are at risk of homelessness. And the cause of this is the lack of education about how to build a financial foundation, starting even before we first enter the workforce and well into our retirement years. My name's Unpaid, and I'm the founder of the Financially Empowered Women podcast. I'm passionate about ending homelessness, and as part of that passion, I chose to look at the systemic barriers that are causing homelessness for women in the first place. The Financially Empowered Women podcast is designed to bring you the best experts from around the world to increase your financial know-how and give you practical and women-specific tips to overcome the challenges you might be facing, such as how to negotiate a better salary, demystifying super, or how to navigate a separation and ensure the assets are distributed fairly. My role is to provide you with the best information out there to change your trajectory and become a financially empowered woman, because you deserve it, and the world needs you more than ever to own your worth and help others to do the same. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Financially Empowered Women podcast. Today I'm here with my guest, Narelle Vigor, and let me tell you a little bit about Narelle. Narelle is an expert and highly qualified career development practitioner, specialising in supporting women over 35 through life and career challenges and transitions. Narelle helps midlife women break free from burnout, bias, and outdated career models, and supports them create futures they actually want to live. Through holistic career re-architecture, blending Eastern wisdom with modern strategy, Narelle supports women to honour their capacity, own their worth, and thrive without compromises that always cost them. Why? Because women don't need to be fixed. The system does. Welcome, Narelle.
Thank you, Dion, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I love what you had to say there about women aren't broken, the system is. It sounds like you might have a bit of a manifesto around that. Would you be willing to share that with us?
Yeah, look, this is one of my, possibly sometimes controversial talking points, but, we look at the evolution of careers, and if you go back in history, there was the days where, we were on farms, and then the Industrial Revolution happened, and then corporatization, digitization, and now the AI revolution. Along the way, we had the silent generation and we had the boomers. And the women in those generations did mostly unpaid work. Careers weren't really a thing. Enter Gen X. And look, I'm 52. I don't know where you sit in that, Dion, but when I went to school, it was like, you women, you can have these careers, rah, rah, rah. It's great. It's an opportunity. It's this and that. And governments have benefited from that. Women have too. They've had opportunities to express themselves in different ways. It's given them financial independence, and there's been lots of positive things. But nowhere along the way did the system go, well, geez, if these women are doing, 38, 40-hour weeks at work and they're still carrying the, 30, 40 hours of unpaid work at home, how is that possible, unless they don't sleep, which we all know is not an answer, right? So I think the system doesn't really support women's choices. Along the way, career has also been redefined in the literature as the interweaving of meaningful purpose in life. So that might be unpaid work. That might be, vocational pursuits in the world of work. It might be study and maybe a combination of those things. So when we redefine career that way, we need to look at a system that can actually support people, but women in particular, because they still carry the unpaid loads predominantly. On top of that, I don't think as Gen X women, we had role models. We didn't have women to look up to. I mean, look, there were a few trailblazers, don't get me wrong, that predated us, but for the most part, our mums and grandmothers worked in the home. They didn't do much, if any, work outside of the home. And so I know when I first started working, the only role models I had were men, or I had to make it up. But this linear trajectory of go to school, get an education, get a job, do good things, rise through the ranks, retire at 65, get the gold watch if you're lucky, and be happy in your retirement is not how it works for women. And even if we did that, we've probably suffered pay gaps, which on average are over 30% over a 10-year average, currently sitting at just under 15% in Australia, according to the latest WGA data. So you kind of go, this is not women's fault that they're discriminated against, that there's pay gaps, that we've got this inordinate workload that's just not manageable by most humans, and that we still try and stuff in having a life around the edges of that and get to midlife and go, holy hell, what do I do with myself? I can't cope with this anymore. Ladies, it's not your fault. You've been juggling a crazy amount of work. So that's why I say the system is broken, not women.
Perfect. There was something that you said which made me think of, it was essentially when we look to males as role models, and that's not to say that males can't be role models, but I can talk about in my own life where I've looked to male role models to say, okay, well, I need to sort of emulate them to be successful in what I'm doing. All that's happened has led to burnout and pain because they have a way of doing things that is just not naturally innate to women. And when women are carrying the unpaid mental load and the physical load around the house, which is still happening, then yeah, it's understandable that. I can think of a few, and all due respect to educators in this role, I'm thinking people like Tony Robbins. But if I tried to, sort of work at the same speed of Tony Robbins, I'd be in a heap on the floor. My life does not support that because of the role that I've chosen to take with child rearing and obviously I still work, but I still am a carer for my children. So yeah.
Yeah. So there's a few things I can touch on with that. And that is, if you look at in Australia, the latest jobs and skills data came out and said if you're a woman and you've got a child under 18 living at home, you're probably doing about 30.4 hours a week unpaid work. Number one. That's almost a full-time job, right? That's 0.8 FTE. It's a lot. And that's jobs and skills. This is not me making it up. This is, this is like solid data. Secondly, I look at the hormonal differences, and I'm not a medical doctor or a scientist. I'm a career counsellor, but testosterone has a different function in the body than estrogen. And look, when we get to midlife, I've listened to a lot of doctors because I'm in the full flight perimenopause myself. Estrogen drops, and estrogen's the care hormone. So estrogen's probably what's kept us stuck in the rut in the first place. And we get to 45, 50 and go, done. I don't have the capacity to care about this the way I used to. And so that's often when people go, something needs to change. I've got to put some stuff down. My head's going to explode. By the way, I'm sweating out my left lung and I don't know why. And it's 3 a.m,
And I'm not sleeping well because I'm waking up.
Exactly. Exactly. So you got to look at the fundamental biological differences. And, there's a lot of debate out there about nature versus nurture. And, and it comes up a lot when you talk about women in STEM because they're traditionally masculine industries. Caring industries are typically feminized. Now, is it that women pick those because things like nursing, caring, certain trades give them flexibility? Potentially, yes. But, I know you've got a background in science and you're a woman and, like I read a lot of data when I did my postgrad studies about women in STEM and the pay gaps there are the biggest. In Australia, they sit at around 34%. And as a career counsellor, if I was working with, young girls coming out of school, I'd be having the conversation. If you're in love with the idea of STEM, by all means do it. But understand there's gender bias and their pay gaps are some of the worst you'll see in the world of work. Now, do we need women in those industries? Yeah, women are brilliant. Like it's a different perspective. It's the whole argument for diversity, right? It's bringing a different perspective. So again, it comes back to the system needs to say, well, hey, this is not okay. And in 2024, there was a study done by Dwyer and Griselda that talked about gendered pay gaps to try and address some of these concerns around is it nurture, is it nature, is it women just take less lower paid jobs, is it women just work less? And in 80% of cases, what they found was women, like for like with men, were earning less. So the pay gaps, they labelled a flexibility tax on the basis that women are perceived as less interested in their careers, less reliable in their careers once they've had children, or if they're young, they're probably going to have children. The whole marriage, home, child thing is perceived as being what's important to women, so therefore they can't be taken seriously. Now, that I find that incredibly offensive as a woman.
Yep.
So again, circles back to that system is broken thing and favouring men for reasons that are just, fundamentally inaccurate and unfair.
Yes, absolutely. If you've been watching the news lately, it's easy to feel a sense of despair between power-hungry global leaders and absolute chaos and division. It can feel like things are spiraling out of control. It's easy to feel overwhelmed and just to have a sense of powerlessness. But there is a way to push back. We can stop looking at what they are doing and start looking at what we can do. At Women for Homes, we firmly believe that where we put our money is making a choice for the kind of world that we want to live in. Our mission is powerful: to mobilise 1 million women to invest $5,000 to end homelessness by 2030 whilst being financially empowered along the way. It's practical, it's tangible, it's something that we can do now, and it's something that we can do to take our power back. Join us at www.womenforhomes.com. That's women4homes.com. So you said something there about STEM and women in STEM, and you pointed out that I am a scientist by training, which I am. And I remember I was doing my PhD, I think it was year 3 out of a 4-year course. We had an event at the university which was called Women in Science. And bearing in mind, like my whole life growing up, I was going to be a scientist. I was going to be in this kind of in this scientific role, whether it was going to be a doctor or something that involved helping people and finding cures for various diseases. I was really passionate about it. All I could see was that. And so I'm doing my PhD, going along very nicely, thank you very much. I go to this Women in Science event, and a supervisor that I absolutely adored, I thought she was amazing. She was a beautiful human. And also she'd worked at Harvard, she'd worked at all these really prestigious universities all around the world. And she said, ladies, there's something that you need to know. The traditional route is that you do your PhD, you get your postdoc, you do maybe about 3 postdocs, and then you get a traditional, sort of researcher type job. But depending on how old you are, if you put off your childbearing until you finish your 3 postdocs, you may find that you may not have children at all, or you'll find it harder to have children.
she also shared her story of having worked in all of these amazing places in the world. She had no superannuation and she couldn't retire because she didn't have enough to sustain her. And she was really sick. In the time that I knew her, she'd gone off for 2 major surgeries, but she couldn't retire even though she was at that age. The other thing that I saw being at the university was what I thought was a stable position actually wasn't, because I saw people in my department who were there as staff. They would have 3-year contracts. They might have got mortgages. They might have thought that they were stable for 3 years. And then those contracts could have been cut at any time. I remember one lady coming in on a 3-year contract. After 6 months, her contract was cut. And then the sort of scrabble and to try and find something else, often at the same university, sometimes having to leave an area. It just really opened my eyes. I am so grateful that I got to see that. And for me, it just meant that I did leave my PhD. I went and had children. I wasn't sure what I was going to do after that, but I was like, I'll figure it out. I'll make it up as I go along. But it was important for me to have children. So I really get that what we think is something that's really stable actually isn't. And I get why there's that conflict when women are thinking, okay, well, yeah, I do want to have children, but I do want to pursue this career, but it's actually not as stable as I thought it was.
Yeah, and that's a really awful choice for a woman to have to make, right? Do I choose a profession that I love and can add value and do meaningful, decent work in, or do I choose having a family because, there's a biological clock on that runs out, probably realistically, 10, 15, maybe 20 years into your career. And it is difficult to juggle both. And, we've seen over, recent generations, women putting children off later and later and later and later to try and get that footing in their career and have some tenure established in whatever field it is. And certainly, that's heartbreaking to hear someone who had such, an academic record and, had obviously given so much to the profession, walk away with no superannuation and, no real tenure where it mattered financially. And that whole idea of insecure work and decent work, or not decent work, is a real sort of thing that there's a guy from the UK called Tristram Hawley. I think he works out of Cambridge, but I'm not sure. Writes about, he's a massive social campaigner for decent work, secure work, all those things that, at a big picture level support people's well-being. It supports productivity, so governments are happy economically that we're all contributing, and it supports social cohesion. But you can't hang it all on women. We've got to change our thinking around that, and just simple things like allowing families to income split. So if a woman does take some time out of the workforce, can income split and have access to her husband's superannuation, so that the household has a lower tax burden, but the woman is also protected in that because she's doing an unpaid role, but still getting remunerated some way, shape or form for doing the caring roles in the home. Now, I don't know why governments wouldn't do that. It doesn't seem like rocket science to say, hey, if you're earning, $100,000 a year, husband, and your wife's at home with the children, we'll call it $50,000 each and tax you on that, but she gets half the super. It would probably solve a lot of problems in divorce courts at the end of the day too, fighting over those sort of long-term assets, because the division would have already taken place and be there. And it, might actually be helpful.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. And I just did a podcast recording with somebody else who works in the insurance industry, and a large insurance company in the US have looked at how much unpaid labor is done by women and the cost of that if it was to be outsourced. And it equates to $200,000 a year. So that's what women's worth is worth. Or, because it could be men staying home with the children. That's what the stay-at-home partner's work is worth, and it's not been adequately addressed or recognised.
Well, that is a big number, isn't it?
Mm.
Because, look, I remember all those years I was home with kids. Golly, I'd be a rich woman.
100%. Now, I do remember that you have a very unique perspective on this area because of your time as a stay-at-home parent. Can you talk a little bit about that? You mentioned that you had lived experience of being a single parent and broke.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I don't actually feel like that's unique because there's so many women out there. 80% of single parent households are led by women. The divorce rate is crazy high at the moment. So, look, I've lived it. My the father of my kids and I divorced when they were 2 and 5. My son was diagnosed by the time he was 11 with auditory processing disorder, Asperger's, and ADHD. So it was a bit of a handful, to say the least, as a little tacker, and especially in his early years at school. So, look, I know the juggle, and I did it with no family around. My family were living overseas at the time, so it was me, and the ongoing negotiation with an ex-husband, which, if you've ever been through a relationship breakdown, it's usually called a breakdown for a reason, because you don't get along and you don't see things the same way, and you have different values and all of those things. So, trying to negotiate, and look, I remember when I was studying counselling and psychotherapy, I couldn't get to a lot of weekend programs because, my ex-husband wouldn't have the kids because it wasn't his weekend, and it wasn't, didn't fit in the box of what the rules were and all of those things. So I remember, having to make so many sacrifices about what was meaningful to me, and, despite being willing to juggle things around. And I think a lot of women find themselves in this place, which is why there's so much poverty attached to single parent households, as I said, the majority of which are women. So again, how do we deal with that? How do we support women through this phase? Because it's not just the day-to-day poverty that they're living in and the impacts on their children, so potential intergenerational impacts. It's also that same woman is not getting superannuation paid. Now, I remember when I first started work, I don't think SGC was even a thing. And the amount that gets paid goes up incrementally each year, which is a good thing. So if you're starting work now, you're probably going to start in a much better place than, say, you or I, Dion, as a young woman. But these women, I mean, my super was absolutely changed, and it's still not brilliant. Despite, having gone back to the workforce. But that's always the trade-off when you work part-time or if you take time out to parent children. So it's the day-to-day impact, but it's also the long-term impact. And I know that's, it feeds into some of your own mission with Women for Homes around that, women are finding themselves homeless. Women in retirement are the biggest growing demographic of homeless people. And we need to start reverse engineering that as a society. Again, I come back to the system's broken. We need to reverse engineer that to look after women. And does it mean we should pay a UBI for women that are home with children of a certain age? Perhaps we should.
You are the second guest I've had who's talked about universal basic income. I'm starting to think that there's something in this that is really important. I liken this to, somebody said to me the other day that they didn't believe in the gender pay gap. And to be honest, I was a little bit flabbergasted. So even though I know about the WGEA studies, and sort of all of the information they've got on their website, I was just so shocked that they'd said that I completely wrote it out of my head. Regardless, in terms of the universal basic income, I'm just starting to realise that this is something that would really level the playing field. And I liken it to when, you might be running the 100 meters race, for example, and where men are at, where they've got the good long-term careers and their super is rising and they don't have the pay gaps that women are experiencing. They're 50 meters ahead, whereas women are 100 meters behind the start line. And so for me, the work that you're doing, the work that I'm doing, the work that we're all doing is really about closing that gap and making it more equal and at parity, because I think it benefits us all. Like it doesn't make sense that I'm a mother with a son. It just doesn't make sense that as a woman, struggling, but need to be educating my son so that he can be the best that he can be. How can somebody do that? How can anybody do that when they don't have housing security, they don't have income security? I think universal basic income could be a really good thing.
It could be for a number of reasons, but in addressing your point, it's a saying, all boats rise in a rising tide. So society benefits holistically from women not being in poverty, or from anyone for that matter not being in poverty. So, and look, as a society, we recognise poverty is a bad thing, but the problem is we're not seeing, I think, some of the structural things that drive women into that through no default of their home. I know what it's like to actually, take ill and, have to sell my house because I couldn't work to pay the mortgage at the time because I had some significant health issues going on. And, they're things that are hard to recover from. And, if you talk about reproductive age and some of those ages when women are engaged in these unpaid activities, it's at an earlier age. So they miss out on the benefit of compounding interest on things like superannuation and actually earning a fair wage and all of that. So it's, at 50, it's bad, but it's not as bad as if it was happening at 20. And, a lot of us have found ourselves, in that situation at 20, being single parents, absolutely flogging ourselves just to barely get by. And it's often the casualised and the lower paid work that women do to fit it in around the edges of their kids. Layer in pay gaps, layer in lack of superannuation and all of those things. And the compound effect of, 60 is, unless they found some way to play catch up, they're in trouble.
100%. And then, one of the things that I hadn't really factored in until recently, because this is something that's happened to me, is the impact of menopause or going into perimenopause and all of the things that we discussed before, the, sort of the sleeping or lack of sleep and the, sort of just not feeling like you're firing on all cylinders, brain fog, all of that. So, I'm thinking of a woman that's come through this period of time where she's had the kids. She's now sort of looking to go back into the workforce or really establish a career. And then she gets hit with menopause and then that compounding effect happens all over again.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You just, you've recovered from what you think is the worst combat course you could ever have lived. And menopause says, hey, lady, hold my beer, let's see what you're made of. And it's true. And again, going back to the data, women drop back to part-time in droves at about 34 and workforce participation at about 52 drops off a cliff. Now, I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to work out what's going on in women's lives across the board that might drive those numbers. And the reality is women's health, even if you're not menopausal, there are a lot of women, and I remember even back in high school, there were girls every month that'd have 2 or 3 days off because, they suffered so terribly with, awful periods or endometriosis or polycystic ovaries and just those type of things that, are not uncommon for women to be dealing with. And, another big piece of the puzzle, and it certainly came out in my white paper research, was, 15 to 20% of women identified as either being diagnosed neurodivergent or suspect that they are, which will make all of these hormonal problems worse. And I know this because I'm late identified myself. And, broadly, the education systems are now recognising they think about 20% of kids or up to are neurodivergent, have some sort of diagnosis. And they're thinking about this in terms of planning. But again, the testing for that was largely developed based on males and how symptoms turn up in privileged white boys. How does it affect their behaviour? How does it affect their, them socially? How does it affect them? Girls were left behind the door because girls mask better, basically. The long and the short of it is, and again, going back to numbers, if you're a female and you're neurodivergent, there is an 80% chance you'll get to 18 undiagnosed, unrecognised. And it would likely turn up somewhere down the track in menopause because when your hormones shift and change and you're not sleeping and you're dealing with all of the 11 billion symptoms that can be menopause, you won't get a mask. And particularly in ADHD, estrogen is really important for dopamine. And people with ADHD have enough trouble with dopamine as it is, and their whole life revolves around chasing the next dopamine hit. And I know this. I've got a son who has ADHD and it runs his rock show, and every other week, something will blow up in his life, and that's great because it's a problem to solve. Hello, dopamine. And it becomes a cyclical problem, and it's tricky to manage. So when you get to your late 40s, maybe even earlier for some women, because they do say if you're neurodivergent, you're probably going to hit perimenopausal symptoms at an earlier age. So, we're talking mid-30s for some people. And that can last for, 10 years or more. Then you've got the postmenopausal adjustment period, which is, they say, takes about 4 to 8 years for your whole system to readjust to the hormones. You're talking 20 years of hormonal disruption that can really impact your energy levels. And this is the case for anyone, like if you're born with a uterus, it's going to get you at some point for a period of time. It just depends whether you're one of the lucky ones who sail through it relatively unscathed, or one of the unlucky ones who, get hit with every symptom and actually have to take a career break, or reduce to part-time and deal with the not sleeping and all of the physical symptoms and the emotional symptoms and psychological symptoms that come with it. So it's a lottery you can't really prepare for.
No, you can't prepare. But what I'm learning for myself is that you can definitely get help. And what I'm interested in for you is because I know that you're a career coach. How do you help women to traverse this rocky path?
Yeah. So in terms of traversing it, capacity is the big thing I like to talk about with women, generally, because often, when we talk about paid and unpaid loads, we've often worked beyond capacity for a long time, and it almost becomes ingrained in our psyche of we must do this. It's part of that people pleasing culture that women tend to have. If I say no, it's going to rock the boat. I'll be seen as not taking my career seriously, or whatever negative thing the self-talk leads us to believe. Having a healthy boundary for ourselves is going to cause for us. But the reality is you have to honor your capacity, or eventually you'll just stop. You'll burn out, and there'll be some sort of breakdown, whether it's physical or mental. And, in honoring that capacity, there are things you can do to perhaps, tease a little bit more capacity out. And one of the things I talk about is a neuroscience hack called flow. Flow state is where you get into that state of, beyond hyperfocus. You lose your sense of self, you lose your sense of time, and you're just totally engrossed in that. And there are some things that will support getting your brain into that space. And one of them is interest-based activities. So if you've ever tried to do something that you're really not interested in, you probably know it's hard, right? To stay focused and engaged with it. And it's just like, oh God, it's a bit of a hardship. Whereas if you're really interested in something, it's easy to get head down, bum up and lose, sense of time. So that can actually change our brain and body chemistry quite significantly. So we produce certain neurotransmitters that, help us feel good. And what science has shown us is that if you've been in flow state, the increase in creative problem solving, the increase in productivity is not just experienced while you're in that state, but for hours and days afterwards. So that is one thing, interest-based careers and talking about building in those, passion activities is important, as distinct from find your passion and it'll all be fine, because no, it won't. But finding interest and passion-based activities, if you can build it into your career, fantastic. If you can get it somewhere outside of your paid work, also fantastic, because of the flow-on benefits that it has to your productivity, creativity, and just general brain chemistry. So that's one thing. And the other thing is actually just realistically looking at, okay, even if we max out on what we can actually do, what does that look like in practical terms? And again, I talk about menopause being difficult to prepare for because it's the sands are constantly moving under your feet. And so that's an ongoing conversation with yourself. Or, in cases of clients, an ongoing conversation they're having with me as things shift and change. And it's where flexibility is super important. Think things like work from home, which, it worked quite well during COVID, can really support women through this period, giving them the flexibility. A lot of women will go through phases where they have horrendous pain and horrendously heavy periods, and actually don't trust they're not going to embarrass themselves if they go out in public, for some days. Or whether it's the poor sleep and just that extra hour in the morning that they don't have to travel makes a difference in terms of how they can function during the day. So it's about self-advocacy as well, and trying to build in the flexibility you need and make that an ongoing conversation. Women, by the time they're dealing with these problems, are incredibly capable. Even if they have done the unpaid work, there's a lot of skills and strengths that they'll have developed during those years that they probably don't recognise. And so leveraging those, having an ongoing conversation with employers, advocating for yourself, is incredibly important. The other thing we see is women starting businesses. So statistically, mid-40s is a time where women will go, the only way I'm going to get flexibility and be able to earn, something of what I need to is to do my own thing. And that can be a really good thing, but it should be done, I think, eyes wide open, not as a reactive way of dealing with a problem, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So not just, oh, screw this, I've had enough of this employer, they're not looking after me, I'm going to go off and start my own thing.
I quit.
I've got no idea how to do that.
Absolutely. And for some people, their makeup doesn't sit well with that in terms of their relationship with risk and uncertainty. And, that is another one of those muscles I try and help build, is being able to sit with uncertainty. Life is uncertainty. One of the theories I leaned right into when I did my postgrad studies was the chaos theory of careers. And, it takes that chaos theory logic and applies it to the world of careers. And the world of work is changing, and it's getting exponentially faster and more different. And again, I circle back to that conversation about a UBI. I don't think AI is going to take all of our jobs, but it certainly will create efficiencies and automations that we need less human labor for. So there's a shifting landscape, and it's shifting really, really quickly. I mean, if 5 years ago, if you were interested in IT, you would have been told, go and learn coding. You'll be set for life. Now, if someone said, I wanted to go into IT, there'd be no way I'd say go and learn coding, because they're a dime a dozen and nobody wants them anymore. AI, learning about that may be a different conversation, because that seems to be the way the world's going. And, that's not to say AI is bad. It can be a great tool. But, you look at where we're at now, and I watched a podcast on Diary of a CEO, and it was a Russian doctor who was an absolute expert in AI security and safety, more importantly. And he was saying we're very, very close now to a form of superintelligence, which means AI will just supersede humans and literally take control of itself. And he was talking about, the dangers of that, and especially when we talk, general AI platforms. The specific niche AI platforms can be really, really helpful tools for us and can help us work better and differently. But nonetheless, with all of that AI stuff, there's going to be a lot of humans have jobs. So does it lead to a renaissance of we grow our own veggies, we cook our own food, we stay home with our kids, we walk to the shops, we do all the things that are actually healthy for humans, because we've got a universal basic income, and there is actually not the need for the human labor that traditionally there has been. I don't know. It's a big question and a big conversation.
It is a big question, and it is a big conversation, and it's definitely one that we as a society need to have before things move too far out of our control. Because I believe that if we don't decide how we want this technology to be used, then it's going to be decided for us. And right now, I believe that altogether we do actually have quite a lot of say and a lot of sway over the trajectory of the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Narelle, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I'd love to know, for anybody who wants to know more about you or how they can work with you in terms of the career coaching work that you do, how can they get hold of you?
Okay. So I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll find me at Soul Compass Careers. You'll also find my website, www.soulcompass.life, where you can find out, more about how I work, some of these things that we've talked about, and also packages. So I specialise in working predominantly with women over 35. I've also got a lot of experience with the veteran community, having spent 5 years in the Defence Force Transition Program. So if either of those apply, then check out the website. Under the resources tab, you'll find some resources for women, and there's a white paper there you can download, as well as a complimentary ebook around flow, and just it can give you some hacks and ideas about just using bits of that. Even if you don't go, full immersion with it, there are just some tips and tricks that can really support you in helping build capacity and remove some friction in your life.
Perfect. And just so everybody knows, these links will be on the website with the podcast. So you'll be able to click and go directly to those resources, the white paper and the complimentary ebooks as well.
They are under the resources tab.
Beautiful. Well, Narelle, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and very eye-opening, and we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you. And look forward to chatting with you again soon. I think that there's so much deeper that we could go with this topic. So I'd love to have you back on the podcast another time.
I'd love that. Thanks so much.